I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Ukraine repels one of the war's largest drone attacks. We look at the new generation of Russian attack drones, and we interview researcher and author Nicole Grajewski on the relationship between Russia and Iran.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 31st of July, 2 years and 163 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and our guest is Nicole Grajewski. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start in Ukraine, where authorities report that Ukrainian air defence has repelled a massive Russian drone attack. The Air Force said it shot down all the incoming projectiles, that was 89 drones and one missile, launched by Russia overnight. The attack mainly targeted the central region of Kyiv, so the capital city and the oblast. Authorities said that more than 40 of the drones were actually shot down over the capital and its outskirts. There were no casualties reported and some damage to buildings. The city and most of Ukraine were under air raid alerts that were issued at around 8 o'clock GMT, so that's around 10 o'clock Ukraine time on Tuesday. Radio Free Europe reported that during the Kyiv air raid alert, which lasted for more than 7 hours, Russian drones attacked the capital in 2 waves, coming from all directions. That comes from Serhiy Popko, the head of Kyiv's military administration. Some more detail from RBC Ukraine, the Ukrainian newswire, who report that the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force called today's Russian drone attack one of the most massive Ukraine had experienced. They used the same number of Shaheds on New Year's Eve, January the 1st, 2024. Back then, the Russians launched 90 drones and Ukrainian air defense shot down 87 of them. This means that today, Ukrainian defenders, this is according to him, set a new record for downed drones. Staying in Ukraine and looking at the front line, the ISW, that's the Institute for the Study of War, the Washington DC-based think tank, have written up some thoughts on the recent Russian advances in Donetsk that I think would be useful to summarise. So they write, quote, Russian forces conducted 5 platoon to battalion-sized mechanised assaults in western Donetsk Oblast on July the 29th and the 30th. Such localised mechanised pushes are likely the manifestation of Russia's forecasted summer offensive, and you'll remember that we had Roland Oliphant on the podcast earlier this week talking about that offensive. Continuing with the ISW, Russian forces likely lack the wider operational capacity to mount a separate, renewed offensive operation in Donetsk Oblast or elsewhere on the front this summer. So this really does bring together quite a few of the stories we've been bringing you over the past week, I think. The ISW go on. Periodic and pulsating Russian mechanised assaults likely represent the extent of Russia's current offensive capacity, and Russia is unlikely to mount a distinct new summer offensive operation due to material and manpower constraints. ISW previously noted that Russian forces have struggled to conduct simultaneous, large-scale offensive operations throughout the war, but are prone to conducting offensive operations in pulses along different sectors of the front, with one sector decreasing in intensity as another sector increases. So something I think that we'll be having to look to over the next few weeks and months before the heating season starts in Ukraine. Moving east, Ukrainian intelligence has reportedly prosecuted a massive cyber attack on the Russian financial sector, which lasted for an entire week. According to RBC Ukraine's sources in the special services, on the evening of July 30th, the cyber experts from the Defense Intelligence Ministry Defense of Ukraine completed one of the largest DDoS attacks. That's the denial of service attack. It's a sort of cyber attack in which the perpetrator seeks to make a network or a machine unavailable to the users by disrupting the services of the host connected in that network. Bit technical, I'm sure we'll get Gareth Caulfield or somebody on in the next few days to go into a little bit more detail and help us explain it. But it was one of the largest attacks on Russian internet infrastructure in history. According to RBC Ukraine, they managed to hit critically important resources and gain access to a large volume of confidential data. RBC continues. Sources in Ukrainian intelligence report that the attack lasted continuously for a week and affected the online services of all major Russian banks, including the central bank, telecommunications service providers, national payment systems, social networks and messengers, government resources, and dozens of other services. Sources told RBC that all the attacked resources were in some way involved in supporting or funding Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine. And finally, Ukraine's Deputy Strategic Industries Minister, that's Hanna Hvozdia, has said that Ukraine has the production capacity to produce more than 3 million drones a year, but does require financing from foreign partners. Quoted by Suspilny, she said, "We have enough large production capacity. We can produce more than 3 million drones of various types today." Some analysis from the Kyiv Independent, who write that Ukraine needs financing for the productions of drones as the state can only cover part of the budget. Funding from foreign partners such as Canada will help to cover the rest of the financing. This is from the minister. And according to her, Kyiv is also in talks with the UK to help purchase domestically produced drones for the Ukrainian military. Well, those are the military frontline updates. Francis, can I turn to you next? Francis Dearnley, what are the latest political and diplomatic developments that you see?
Thanks, David. Before turning to Ukraine, given the gravity of this story this morning and its potential implications for geopolitics more widely, I'm going to look at the Middle East first, where Iran's supreme leader has just vowed severe punishment for Israel for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's top political leader, in Tehran. Haniyeh was struck by an airborne projectile in the Iranian capital early this morning in an assassination that is likely to heighten tensions further in the Middle East, coming just hours after Israel claimed to have just killed a senior commander of Iran-backed Hezbollah in an airstrike on Beirut. The ties between Russia, Iran and Hamas are very well known and will be the subject of our interview in today's episode, so I won't churn up all that here. But if things escalate, which personally I think is unlikely in a meaningful sense, if they were going to, I think they would have by now, then expect to see eyes divert away from Ukraine for a while, as they have periodically in the past few months. Now, Haniyeh's death raises significant questions about the future of Hamas's ceasefire negotiations with Israel. For Benjamin Netanyahu, this could be seen as a political victory, providing the leverage needed to finalise a ceasefire and hostage exchange deal. However, Haniyeh has been a key player in the ceasefire negotiations and was seen as a broker between rival factions within the movement. Some are asking whether someone more extreme is now likely to replace him, though it's hard to see how one can be much more extreme than someone who mandated the attacks of October 7th. Suffice to say, David, the Telegraph is covering events in the Middle East in great detail, so if you wish to monitor that evolving story further, I recommend our live blog as well as our political coverage more broadly. Now, I mentioned negotiations in that Middle Eastern context a moment ago, and in Ukraine, we have obviously been closely following whether there were any further outcomes from the meeting between Ukraine's Foreign Minister Kuleba and Xi's representatives in Beijing. Well, yesterday, the Ukrainians invited Foreign Minister Wang Yi to visit Ukraine, with Beijing indicated it is interested in that proposal. To quote a Kyiv spokesman, "We are ready to welcome Minister Yi in Ukraine to see firsthand the consequences of the Russian aggression against our country and hold deeper bilateral talks with him on a number of regional and international issues." I think we should just read that as a confirmation, if needed, that the talks last week were evidently fruitful enough that there is a desire from the Ukrainians, at least, to keep dialogue open. Now, if you missed yesterday's episode, and will be personally insulted if you did, we did a deeper dive than usual with Lillian at the Kyiv Independent about the cost of the war. That included speculation about Ukrainian debt. And Reuters report today that President Zelensky has signed a law allowing the government to suspend foreign debt payments until October the 1st, paving the way for a moratorium to be called that would formally mark a sovereign default. Now, that's not quite as severe as it sounds. Earlier this month, Ukraine announced a preliminary deal with a committee of its main bondholders to restructure its near 20 billion worth of international debt. a short-term default would have a less significant impact, it's believed, on its long-term borrowing prospects than a default with no deal in sight. A proposal would see a 37% nominal cut on Ukraine's outstanding international bonds, saving Kyiv around $11.4 billion in payments over the next 3 years, the duration of the country's programme with the International Monetary Fund, according to government statements. Now, I know a few of you will have just glazed over in all of that, so let me just summarise it very, very, very simply. Kyiv is trying to keep ways of being economically robust despite the fact that it is bleeding money, just as it is bleeding men and material as a consequence of fighting a protracted war. It is not on the precipice economically, but it is important to emphasise that the only way it is able to fight this war is because of the support that it is receiving by its foreign backers and indeed understandings about the fact that it may well be obliged to default. Moscow, of course, is having its own problems, economically and in terms of recruitment. Indeed, there are reports today that Putin will increase the federal signing bonus for recruits from 195,000 to 400,000 rubles, with regional governments expected to match or exceed this amount, possibly even enough, in some cases, for soldiers to purchase an apartment. These signing bonuses represent a significant budget allocation. Russia claims it can mobilise 100,000 soldiers in 3 to 4 months, assuming the total bonus per recruit is 1 million rubles. This equates to 400 billion rubles, which is approximately $4.5 billion, just to remind listeners, annually. However, these expenses are overshadowed by the costs of compensating injured soldiers and the families of those killed, which range from, again, 4.5 million rubles per person. If Russian casualties are indeed 1,000 per day, as is widely reported, the annual compensation would exceed 1.2 trillion rubles. And remarkably, the combined cost of signing bonuses and casualty compensation might approach the total salaries paid to soldiers in Ukraine, with 500,000 of them earning 300,000 rubles monthly. The annual salary expenditure would be 1.8 trillion rubles. Now, again, one has to wonder whether that is sustainable over the long term, or if this is an example of Russia paying up front, as it were, to try and put the pressure on politically and militarily now at this crucial juncture where negotiations are being discussed, and where, if President Trump wins in November, we might see imposed, or an attempt to impose, negotiations on the Ukrainians, and the Russians will want to be in the strongest possible negotiating position, which of course they hope having a lot of soldiers would enable. And since I mentioned the United States, lastly, just one quick update on the evolving situation in Washington at the moment, with Axios reporting that Brian Nelson, the Treasury Department's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, is preparing to leave the Biden administration and join Vice President Harris's presidential campaign instead. Now, I mention this because at the Treasury, Nelson has focused on imposing sanctions on Russia and Hamas, working with international allies to ensure that targeted companies and entities don't avoid sanctions. I think it's been a moderate success given the nature of sanctions at the moment and how countries are going about avoiding them, something we've covered in detail. But nevertheless, that's not why I'm mentioning it. I'm mentioning it because it's a top appointment in Harris's camp who is extremely invested in the topic of Ukraine, something, of course, that contrasts quite extensively with the Republican Party at the moment, with Trump and Vance at the helm. So a few interesting stories going on at the moment, David, but that's where we are.
Thank you very much, Francis. Joe, can I come to you? A couple of stories that you've been looking at. Let's start with this new footage emerging of a potential new Russian attack drone that's been dubbed the, quote, younger sister of the Iranian-made Shahed 136. What have you found, Joe Barnes?
Yeah, last time I was on the pod, I briefly spoke about how Russia was perhaps able to better scale up production of innovations in a better way than the Ukrainians at times, especially when some of these innovations have been first seen in the hands of the Ukrainians. And I think here is actually one of the sort of concrete examples of this scaled up production. So we've got this new model of a Russian drone that has combined the elements of the first-person view drones, where the drone's piloted with goggles, where basically the pilot sees exactly where the drone is going for a first-person camera. That's been slapped together with the design and the manufacturing of an Iranian Shahed 136, which we know Russians have used a significant amount since being given them by Tehran. So soon after, 2 of these drones were intercepted over Ukraine and found in relatively good condition, a promotional video started circulating online, which has basically given us more details from the Russian side on this drone. It's known as the Gabira. David introduced it as. It's been dubbed the younger sister of the Shahed 136. There were a few reasons behind the moniker, the younger sister moniker. Firstly, it looks almost identical to the Shahed. Think the Shahed has that sort of wingspan, like one singular wingspan, almost Concorde-like, but coloured white. This time the Jabera is coloured black. And then secondly, the video footage was first shared by a Russian unit known as Stalin's Falcons. That's a name that sort of harks back to the Soviet Union's World War II flyers. But this unit has ties to the Alabuga facility in Tatarstan, where Russia is building thousands of Iranian-designed drones. So it's the factory that's been set up specifically for a domestic production of Shahed 136 and other Shahed variants. So this, according to the Ukrainian website Defense Express, provides an indication that Russian engineers have managed to reverse engineer and recreate the Shahed 136 kamikaze drone and basically create it into a domestically built model. The first look of these drones, mainly from the intercepted versions, and Ukrainian analysts have been poring over these things, have found that they're made with a foamed plastic fuselage and reinforced with plywood, so sort of very cheap, lightweight materials, and I'll come back to that later. But then back to the video that was circulated, the designers behind the Jabera claim the drone is available in 3 different variants. First, a kamikaze attack model, so one-way attack drone, fitted with a warhead, flies at its target, detonates on impact, no more. That's exactly what the Shahed 136 is doing and does. But then, the Russian Jabera could also be deployed as an electronic warfare jammer, essentially flying over areas of the battlefield using electronic warfare equipment to block radio frequencies used by Ukrainian drones and weapons in that area. So something common on both sides these days, so better in the Russian hands, they have more of it. So this is potentially an innovation of a drone deployed EW, as it's known from the Russian side. And then the third deployment could be as a false target. And I know I've spoken about this on recent podcasts. Russia has been increasingly using drones to exhaust and expose Ukrainian air defences before launching missile attacks. So one thing, when I was looking at the drone attack today, it was 89 drones, 1 missile. Wouldn't surprise me tomorrow that Russia actually unleashes a load of missiles, thinking and working on the assumption that Ukraine has expended or being forced to move air defences and air defence systems that have either sort of used munitions or have actually exposed themselves so the Russians know where they are, so they've actually got to move them. But back to the Jabera, its designers in the promotional video also said it could work in a swarm that could be used to overwhelm Ukrainian air defences and positions. So Ukrainians are very, very good at intercepting a singular drone. If you start using them in pairs, multiple pairs, in a swarm, it becomes a lot harder. The notable difference between this Jabera and the Shahed 136 is that the Russian version is fitted with a camera and a radio transmitter of some sort that allows the first-person view element. So it basically allows manual control of the drone. The Iranian models are pre-programmed with assigned targets, basically allowing for less flexibility once they're launched. You send them up in the air and they fly to their target. This does, again, according to Defense Express, indicate that the Jabera has a likely lesser range, probably around 60 miles, because of the required radio signal strength there needed to control such a system. So Ukrainian analysts actually believe the Jabera variants built to gather intelligence have a much longer range. Some people suggest up to sort of 300 kilometres, or what's that, about 180 miles-ish. And then interestingly, one example downed over Ukraine revealed that the Jabera drone was actually fitted with a Ukrainian 4G SIM card that basically allowed it to hunt for radar systems while using Ukraine's mobile network to relay that data back to Russian forces. Similar systems were found in a wreckage of Iranian Shahed drones discovered on the battlefield, I believe in November 23 from the top of my head. So yeah, really, really interesting sort of elements that Russia is trying to use to sort of boost its drone program. And then a spokesman for Ukraine's military intelligence agency last week said that the Russians were resorting to cheaper, lightweight drones to hunt out Ukrainian air defence positions. One, because the lighter weight drones are harder, they're less likely to be picked up on radar, they're harder to detect than a missile, but also they're just cheaper to fire. So actually it's harder to make a precision missile than it is to make a drone. So that's why Russia's using them.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. That was hugely in-depth, I think just what we needed. One more story from you then. I mean, we've spoken over the years now of Russia's nuclear posturing, saber rattling drills. There's been more of them. What have you found there?
Yeah, so the latest in Russian sort of saber rattling is Russia, via a presidential decree from Putin, has ordered fighting troops in Ukraine to train for the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. The training exercises will involve Iskander ballistic missiles and various aircraft, and that's according to a statement shared on the Telegraph messaging app by Russia's defence ministry, and this is what it had to say, and I quote, "During the exercise, issues of preparing units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation for the combat use of non-strategic nuclear weapons will be worked out. As part of this exercise, the personnel of the missile formations of the southern and central military districts will work out combat training tasks of obtaining special training ammunition for the Iskander-M operational tactical missile systems, equipping launch vehicles with them, and covertly advancing to designated positions in preparation for conducting electronic launches. The ongoing stage of the exercise is aimed at gaining the readiness of personnel and equipment of units for the combat use of non-strategic nuclear weapons to Russia to carry out combat missions." That's what the statement adds. Yeah, so what do we know? Tactical nuclear weapons, they are smaller with their warheads, and they're designed to achieve a very specific battlefield objective. That compared to a strategic nuclear bomb, which are basically designed as a deterrence and meant to wipe out entire cities that they target. So we're looking at the Russians trading on tactical weapons that they could use to turn a specific part of the battlefield, say in Ukraine or anywhere else, on its head. Pro-Kremlin outriders have repeatedly sort of urged the use of nuclear weapons both inside and outside of Ukraine. Adding caution to this, we shouldn't be shocked. It's sort of the rhetoric and saber rattling that we've basically grown to become accustomed to. Ukrainian gains on the battlefield are often met with calls for the use of tactical strikes to protect against potential advances into Russian-occupied territories, especially around the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, where the Kremlin held phony sham referendums and claimed basically that those regions had declared independence from Ukraine in order to join Russia. Complete fiction, but we'll let the Russians believe what they want to believe. And then you also have the use of nuclear weapons against the likes of Britain, other Western allies to Ukraine, and most recently, I think, the Moscow-based Council for Foreign and Defence Policy, which is a think tank that is often used to shape or considered to shape Russian government thinking. It this year, I think in May, proposed a demonstrative nuclear explosion, which would be aimed at deterring the West from sending arms to Ukraine. So sort of, yeah, all in the rhetoric. The military districts, which are essentially the groupings of force that Russia has that make up its armed forces, there's 5 of them. 2 of them are part of these exercises, the southern and central military districts. The southern district is pretty vast in terms of what it overseas, but it also includes Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson under its umbrella. And then the central grouping is almost entirely tasked with Moscow's main offensive manoeuvres in Ukraine at the moment in eastern Donetsk. It's the central force grouping basically responsible for the capture of Avdiivka and the subsequent push west out of that city since February, and that's according to the US-based Institute of the Study of War. This isn't the first time that nuclear exercises have been held. If we look back again to May, Moscow's defense ministry released footage of its forces rehearsing a cross-border strike into Ukraine using, again, Iskander missiles equipped with what it described as special purpose warheads, which we don't actually know what they were, but we assume they were nuclear warheads. Typically, Western analysts always have disregarded these threats as nuclear blackmail, saber rattling, rather than genuine plans to carry out a strike in Ukraine or elsewhere. So sort of one to watch out for, but not one to overly worry about, according to most analysts. But interestingly, the latest drills that Putin has ordered come days after he threatened to restart production of mid-range nuclear weapons in response to planned US missile deployments, mainly of Tomahawks in Germany, but just in Europe in general. So it's actually sort of the saber rattling continues in response to something that the US is doing in Europe.
Thank you so much, Francis and Joe. The relationship between Russia and Iran is one of the most important international connections in this war. Iran supplies missiles and drones to the Russian Federation, and Russia has become an increasingly important trading partner to the Islamic Republic. But the diplomacy between the two nations is much, much more complex than it may first appear. To help us understand the Russo-Iranian relationship, its advantages, challenges and nuances, I spoke to author and researcher Nicole Grajewski. Here's the first part of our conversation. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for your time. Before we start, would you just introduce yourself and your research to our listeners?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I'm Nicole Grajewski. I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. in the Nuclear Policy Program. My work mostly focuses on the Russia-Iran relationship. I've just recently wrote a book on this, and I've been studying it for almost a decade.
Well, it's a huge subject, and I've been wondering for quite a few days now before doing this interview where to start. One fairly fruitful place to start might be the Syrian Civil War. That seems to be when you date the kind of modern era of cooperation, of Iranian-Russian cooperation, sort of takes off in the form that we see it today. So can we start there? What happens in the Syrian Civil War, and how does that bring Russia and Iran closer together?
Well, the Syrian Civil War really was the kind of start of what we see this modern Russia-Iran relationship in terms of what is manifesting on the battlefield in Ukraine. But Syria began really in 2011, and Russia and Iran were involved in various degrees of intensity. I mean, Iran did supply munitions, Iran had advisors on the ground, but they weren't really militarily fully involved until 2014. Russia, supported Syria on the UN Security Council. They blocked resolutions that were about Assad leaving and also criticizing Assad. So there was different, I guess, kind of like this degree of separation between what they were actively involved in. But around late 2014, Assad really lost quite a bit of territory. There was the rise of the Islamic State. There was also opposition groups that were really gaining more traction. And Qasem Soleimani, who was the former Quds Force general, really wanted to, seek Russian involvement and have them commit militarily. And Iran made several outreaches to the Russians throughout late 2014 and early 2015. But it wasn't until, I think, June of 2015 that the Russians really decided to commit militarily. And you see Soleimani flying to Moscow to kind of lay the groundwork for this operation in Syria. Then in September, Russian jets take off. They have an airfield in Syria now, and they go and support operations against the Islamic State and also against opposition fighters. And then this is kind of where you see this intensity and kind of the institutionalization of this relationship. Iranian forces on the ground with Russian air support. And this required a lot of, open communication channels and new bureaucratic ties between the two countries. And this is where it became a lot more entrenched. You see Russia and Iran operating for joint campaigns like Aleppo, but also having joint command centers and having Iranian proxy forces and also IRGC forces working on joint campaigns with the Russians. And I think that experience was really crucial because some of these networks and some of these ties between Russian and Iranian officials eventually kind of pervaded to the Ukrainian battlefield.
And in those early exchanges, teaming up, if you will, of Iran and Russia, how did that go? Did they find it easy to work with each other? Did they get along? What was that like at the early days?
It wasn't actually at all very easy. So just by nature of the Iranian involvement in Syria, it involved proxy forces and also IRGC contingents. But the Russians, they have a much more traditional, centralized military. And so coordinating between the Russians and the Iranians was quite difficult at times. And Iran would often lament that Russia wasn't providing adequate air support, that Russia was kind of grandstanding, having symphonies in Palmyra while IRGC forces were fighting al-Nusra, for example. And so that did provide tension. And even after a lot of the regime victories or the regime coalition victories, Russia and Iran were competing over certain areas of influence in Syria. So there'd be clashes between actually Russian-backed groups and Iranian-backed groups over control over certain types of posts or areas of Syria like Deir ez-Zor. So it wasn't very easy. And I think that the challenge was really communication and also conflicting kind of broader goals in Syria.
Could you talk about those broader goals then? Where did they start in Syria and how did they evolve towards the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Because it feels as if, to a sort of lay observer like myself, that the goals are now much more aligned than perhaps they were, but please feel free to correct me on that.
Well, I mean, there was certain issues with like Syrian reconstruction, for example. So after most of the fighting kind of subsided, Russia wanted to attract Gulf investment. They wanted to attract foreign investment. It's obviously a little bit more difficult because Syria is under sanctions, so European and United States aren't really going to go pour money into Syria. But what the Russians wanted to do was kind of open up Syria, kind of counterbalance a lot of Iranian influence, because Iran was making quite a bit of local connections in the real estate markets with local leaders, trying to have an economic footprint there. And for the Iranians, I mean, they invested so much more financially in Syria than the Russians. And so for them, they wanted to reap some of these benefits. But there was competition over certain gas contracts, over certain phosphate contracts, where the Iranians would have a deal and the Russians would sweep in and actually take it from them. Then there was also the issue about how Syria would look after the war. Russia, I think for a long time actually was promoting kind of some kind of nominal federal structure where like the Kurds would have a role and also parts of the former Syrian opposition that kind of became integrated into the Assad regime. Whereas Iran really wanted a centralized Alawite state with Assad himself because that kind of opened the possibility for more influence versus a federal structure. So those kind of issues were there. And then, of course, the role of Israel and the role of Iranian-backed forces in southern Syria. And Russia found that escalatory. It also opened up Russian assets to Israeli strikes because of the proximity to Iranian forces. So those were some of the main kind of issues about like the future of Syria and what would evolve from there.
How does that change moving on from Syria then to the late 2010s, heading to 2020 and into the early 2020s? How do those influences and interests change for Iran and Russia?
I would say that things started to evolve actually around the war in Ukraine. I mean, Russia's obviously not as focused in Syria as it was before, but they never really had this like large military footprint. But Russia and Iran also kind of, I think they learned how to adapt and work together a lot more. So you'd see this competition happening in Syria, but also closer coordination in other areas. Like, for example, Russia really pushed for Iran to join the SCO in 2021. Russia and Iran also have been working on kind of more transport endeavors. And then also there is this military-to-military channel that I think stayed pretty robust, especially at the general staff level, even despite these kind of contracts and, I guess conflicts over contracts, conflicts over control in the Syrian government.
Before we talk in a lot more detail about the war in Ukraine, let's take a bit of a step back. Could you just talk about the regimes? How are the Iranian and Russian regimes similar? How are they different?
I mean, Russia and Iran seem quite different on the outside. I mean, Iran is a theocratic Islamic regime, and Russia is this kind of autocratic, bereft of any kind of ideology except for Putin himself kind of state. But they do have, I think, some similarities, and I think this has been a point of convergence between them. And it's this kind of fundamental ethos in this relationship where both view themselves as kind of being the target of Western interference. The kind of centralized state apparatuses in both countries have a vision that are kind of inclined to support each other. So you have the Russian kind of Security Council, you have Vladimir Putin, who are much more about, Russia's role as a strong, like domestic kind of sovereign democracy, ability to crack down on protests, but also counter the United States, Europe on an international level. And that really aligns with the way that the Iranian regime sees the world. And these kind of conservatives in both countries have been really instrumental to pushing this relationship forward. There's obviously differences. I mean, the nature of the Iranian regime operates, I guess, in some ways a lot more informally than the Russian state does. And there's a lot more kind of informal economics, a lot of informal networks that really operate behind the scenes in Iran, whereas Russia seems to be a lot more of a, I guess, like facade of a operating federal government, if that makes sense.
What's the relationship like between Vladimir Putin and the leaders of Iran? Again, sort of, do they get on, or is this purely a marriage of convenience? What do we see in their body language? What do we see in how they treat each other and behave with each other?
I think that there's a affinity, I think, between Putin and the supreme leader. This has been, I guess, articulated in various statements, and Putin has spent long time meeting with the supreme leader whenever he goes to Tehran. But the Iranians have been often quite critical of Russia, and Putin himself, but also just in general, Russian officials, because they view the Russians as treating them as inferior, as not showing them the respect they deserve. They often would criticize Russia's relationship with countries like Israel. So there's that side of it. But I do think that since, I would say, I guess the Raisi presidency, Putin himself has shown much more affinity towards Raisi and the conservatives than he did with Rouhani, who was kind of trying to, do modest outreach towards the West and also over its nuclear program. So that would be, I think, but I wouldn't say that it's the way that you see Putin and Xi. It's not that kind of, I guess, like brotherly camaraderie, I guess.
What was the Iranian reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine, to the full-scale invasion?
Well, the reaction in Iran was, it wasn't monolithic. So there are factions within Iran that traditionally view Russia as being this kind of imperialist power, as being this historical enemy of Iran and also interfering in its domestic affairs. And so there was criticism from certain factions within Iran. But the kind of main leadership and also those who really wield power in Iran viewed this as kind of a divine gift, as a way for Iran to not only strengthen its ties to Russia, but also as kind of an indication of the West's decline in some sense, and also validation for their narrative that they've been promoting since the Islamic Revolution, that the West is this kind of enemy and that they have these evil machinations, and that NATO expansions aim to go and damage other countries' security. And so they really promoted the Russian narrative, even calling it a special military operation at the outset. And so there was this kind of, I guess, coordinated government response that was almost an outpouring of support to the Russians.
What is the current sort of technical state of relations between the two countries? Do they have a formal alliance? How exactly would we describe it?
The Russia-Iran relationship is not an alliance. Alliances typically involve some kind of mutual defense pact or agreement to support one another in the instance that one would be in a war with another country. And I don't think that necessarily means that they're not closer than they were in the past. I think it's a malleable partnership. It is a partnership. It's one of Russia's closer partnerships, and it's one of Iran's closer partnerships. There is a lot of historical mistrust, and that is frequently brought up to kind of obscure how close they've actually become. So it's not an alliance, but it is one of the more vital partnerships for both countries. And this pervades to the realms of military, but also economics and sanctions evasion, and the personal affinities and kind of synergies when it comes to their worldviews.
Many Ukrainians will know the sort of Iranian involvement in Ukraine through one particular kamikaze single-use drone, the Shahed series of drones that Iran has sent thousands of to Russia. I mean, I've seen one myself in a secret laboratory in Kiev. It's quite an impressive sight. It's a big old thing. Could you talk a little bit about what Iran gets from this arrangement of sending drones and material and more? I mean, again, you tell us, more to Russia to aid Russia's war effort. What do the Iranians get out of this?
Well, for one, I think, at least at the political level, Iran gets to showcase its military technology and use it against NATO assets. And that, I think, really is in line with this kind of broader, I guess, animosity between Iran and the West and NATO. It also provides Iran with tangible learning experiences about the operational use of its drones. I think that's really important for that. I mean, for the Russia-Iran relationship, it changes the dynamics fundamentally. I mean, in the past, Russia supplied Iran with military equipment, with arms deals, and Iran was really kind of this client in this patron-client relationship. And now it's a lot more equal. Russia's much more reliant on Iran, and it kind of changes that internal dynamics. And I think that for Iran was quite attractive in that sense. And obviously, you see this expansion in Russia actually providing Iran with more advanced technology and also a greater willingness to support Iran's research and development in certain sectors as well.
Thank you so much, Nicole. You'll hear the second part of that interview tomorrow. Coming up, we hear Francis and Joe's final thoughts. Let's go then to our final thoughts. Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Thanks, David. It's really interesting reflecting on the nuclear blackmail, as Joe just talked about. I think it's really vital that we remember just how illogical in many ways Russia using some kind of atomic weapon would be. For one, China has made it very, very clear to Russia that it would see any such escalation, that really would be an escalation, as something that it would not tolerate. And indeed, of course, Russia is absolutely reliant on China's support financially and politically. And so it would be immediately severing that. Then, of course, we've already seen the West lay down very clearly what its response would be if nuclear weapons were used in Ukraine, and that would be the conventional destruction of basically the Russian army's ability to operate, if not worse. That was first determined very early on in the war when we first saw the saber rattling coming out of Moscow. So again, not militarily advisable. And then last but not least, if you're trying to seize territory, the last thing you want to do is nuke it, frankly. And so we would only be seeing that, I think, in a situation where Russia were completely and utterly illogical and irrational, which I don't believe it is, and were being defeated. And at the moment, it's certainly from its perspective, actually making gains. So I think we should see this very, very much as a political instrument designed for a Western audience, rather than being seen as some attempt to lay the groundwork for some use of such a weapon. It is just not practical or politically advisable at the present moment, nor do I think, by the way, at any stage will it be so. I think it's simply the fact that Russia knows it has this in its locker and it is its trump card, and it will play it whenever it thinks it's to its advantage to do so. But just changing subject briefly for my final thought proper, I spoke earlier on about the economic situation in Ukraine, something we focused on in yesterday's episode too. So one for budding economists or real economists out there to check out that episode if it's something you're particularly interested in. The one thing I wanted to mention on top of this is some interesting statistics that have come out of Ukraine in the past week or so. Around 32% of Ukrainian families only have enough income to buy food, according to a survey published by a media outlet over there. Over 48% of respondents said their families have enough finance for food and clothes, but have to save for something more expensive, while 9% said they do not have enough money even for food. According to that survey, Ukrainians spend the most on food and the least on recreation and entertainment. Now, I mention this because I think it just underlines the fact that the experience of this war is very different depending on geography. One often sees footage and hears from, of course, and understandably, cities like Kyiv, Lviv, and other places. But ultimately, those places are still functioning at quite a high standard economically. You know, the restaurants are still open, etc. But the reality is that in large parts of the country, this is not the experience of war. It is far more intense, far more challenging, and there is much, much more hardship in terms of getting everyday supplies, which is why, of course, we've focused and spoken to so many charities who are seeking to get support to those communities, which are quite often at or very close to the front line, and where organisations like the Red Cross do not deem it safe enough to go. So I just wanted to underline that consumer confidence too in Ukraine has dropped quite considerably in the last few weeks as a result of the power outages, of mobilisation as well. So the Ukrainian economy is not in the best of places at the moment. That's very different than saying that it's on the precipice or anything like that. It's not. But I just wanted to stress that this is not a country that is economically healthy either at the moment. We often focus on Russia, but despite the fact that Kyiv is very much bailed out by the West and has a lot to be thankful for in that sense, but also is much more resilient, you could argue, than, say, Russia's reliance on China, because there are so many countries that are involved in supporting Kyiv. Nevertheless, the idea that one might sometimes get from cities and from reports there that life is going on as normal, I think this just puts pay to some myths that are present about the state of play at the moment as far as the Ukrainian economy and lifestyle is for ordinary Ukrainian citizens, which is why I mentioned them today.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. Joe, would you like the very final words for today?
Yeah, so I spoke about in my piece on drones about sort of Russia's ability to scale up production. There has actually been some interesting news out of Ukraine on that, and Ukraine's Deputy Strategic Industries Minister, Hanna Hovdia, says that Ukraine has the capacity to produce more than 3 million drones a year, but that requires financing from foreign partners. So actually, Ukraine, whether it be the state or private companies, are able to find and put together production lines that could potentially do this, or find the ability to do that, but they're struggling for the cash. So you have schemes like the Drone Coalition, headed up by the UK and Latvia, which basically has countries like Canada and the Netherlands, other nations pledging cash, either to buy drones or help with drone production for Ukraine. So sort of there's money coming in, but is it enough? We don't know. That there is capacity, but they're struggling to find the cash to scale it up. So yeah, it's one to sort of watch out for and keep an eye on how Ukraine is sort of bridging the problem between finding the resources, capacity and the cash to fuel all of that when it comes to scaling up drone production.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.